Ephesians 5:21 through 24 encourages wives to submit to their husbands. But what does that really mean? Does it mean that the husband is in charge in the marriage? Let's talk about it today on 3-Minute Theology. Paul writes, "For a husband is the head of his wife." In our culture, the word head makes us think of a leader or the head of a large company, someone who's in charge. And if we were to read it with that meaning, it would sound like this. The husband is the head of the wife as the CEO is the head of a company. He gets to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. And while that might be what head means in our modern English language, that's not what Paul meant and is not the kind of headship he's talking about. Paul establishes that mutual submission is a behavior for all believers, men and women, in Ephesians 5:21. So what does a husband is the head of his wife mean? In the first century, the Greek word for head rarely meant a person in authority over others. Paul is essentially thinking about the head of the body, literally our head, and he's treating it as a metaphor with the next part of the text revealing what the metaphor is a picture of, how Christ is the head of the church. Paul is not talking about authority or who is or isn't the leader in the marriage. His point is illustrating unity within the relationship. If anything, Paul is actually challenging commonly held customs of his day. Paul continues and explains how Jesus is the head of the body, stating his body of which he is the Savior. And that last phrase explains what Paul means by headship. Headship is connected to Jesus being our Savior and how he is life-giving. Had Paul wanted to use this illustration to communicate Jesus as the authority over the church as a parallel to the marriage relationship, he would have used different language. He could have said that Jesus is Lord or Master of the body rather than Savior of the body. In fact, Paul doesn't use any of the typical Greek words that could be defined as leader, ruler, or authority for husbands. In Ephesians 5:22 through 33, Paul uses verbs that can be defined as yield, love, nourish, and unite. In fact, nowhere in his letters does Paul use language that endorses husbands being in charge of their wives. The only passage we have that talks about authority in marriage is in 1 Corinthians 7, and there, Paul talks about both the husband and the wife coming under the authority of each other. I think what Paul is saying is so clear. His vision for marriage is a revolutionary one where each partner is connected to the other in a mutual life-giving relationship of love, submission, and authority. To assert that Paul is trying to say who's in charge in the marriage is to add to the text just what isn't there. And so the goal for husbands is not to try to be in charge, but to be life-giving and empowering to their wives, like Jesus empowers the church. Strangely, though, some have used the issue of headship to somehow limit or prohibit women from holding certain positions of leadership in the church. And when we put what Paul is saying in context, that has nothing to do with what Paul is saying. He's talking about marriage and the mutual submission that should exist. Headship should never limit women from serving in any capacity. If anything, it should actually empower them to fulfill their God-given purpose, just as Jesus empowers his church. Well, that's all for this 3-Minute Theology. Until next time.